It's a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Robert Higgs, the new Juan de Mariana Prize of 2015, and with whom I have correspondence for many years, but we haven't met until today. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a talk for about 20 minutes, and then we will open the discussion to the floor if you would like to ask any questions. Dear Professor Higgs, dear Bob, may I call you Bob? Thank you for being here. And my first question will be, how did you come to be first an economist and then a libertarian economist?
I started to study engineering when I went to college, and part of my engineering requirements involved taking 2 introductory courses in economics. And as soon as I began to take my first course, I simply fell in love with the subject. It held an interest for me that engineering did not hold. Even though I was doing well enough in my engineering studies, I was not particularly thrilled with being an engineer, but economics seemed to me to be a fascinating subject, and so it attracted me immediately. So I finished my degree in economics and did not expect to go any farther, but I turned out to go to graduate school, and when I did that, I did not intend to be a professor, but in the course of getting through my PhD work, it was just naturally assumed that students would become professors, and they were taught to prepare them for that, and so I ended up to be a professor. So in a way, I was dragged along by circumstances. Life is full of accidents and unexpected turns, and so my becoming an economist was like that. As for being a libertarian economist, I think in part I owed that to my training in graduate school, because even though I was trained in neoclassical economics, I did learn how markets work, basically. I learned the importance of incentives and constraints and the effect that changes in relative costs have on people's decisions. And so having learned that much economics, and a good deal more that I had to give up later on as I began to educate myself better, I was already a pro-market economist when I began my own teaching in 1968. But I think I quickly became even more pro-market than my colleagues, in part because I discovered the writings of Hayek and began to read Hayek, and that reading led me to other authors, and eventually, some years later, to reading Mises, which was a real turning point in my career. Mises actually changed my views about what I'd been doing and how I'd been doing it, and even though I was having good success as a neoclassical economist, I couldn't continue in exactly the same way after I'd read Mises. So it was, in my case, not a great flash of light that came to me and transformed me. It was a very slow process of learning, mostly self-directed learning, in which I just learned one new thing after another and was led from one author to another.
The only point that looks unsatisfactory to me in this story is the movement from the neoclassical framework to a framework that is more sympathetic to the free market. Because we economists that have been trained in the neoclassical school, the mainstream economics, we were trained to think of the market as a resource allocation mechanism. And if you don't move out from that framework, it is only natural to start believing that there is something like perfect competition, and the next step is to rapidly find out that competition is not perfect, and that markets fail, and then naturally you drop to the idea that the state has to intervene. So in what point in that story you jump out?
Well, I think part of my change had to do with starting to work in the University of Washington, which was my first institution. And Washington had a number of economists trained at the University of Chicago. And even though they were neoclassical economists, they were not the same as the people who worked at MIT and Stanford and Berkeley and other top universities. They were different in their outlook on the market. They believed that the whole idea of talking about perfect markets in the standard neoclassical manner was misguided. They thought that while the market might not be perfect in the sense that it did not conform to the requirements of the model of perfect competition in general equilibrium, it was the best institutional context available to real human beings in a world where we could never live in that model world. So the Chicagoans moved me in the right direction, and then Hayek and Mises pushed me all the way in what I now consider the proper direction, because I finally had to abandon completely the neoclassical welfare economics analysis, which to me has been one of the most unfortunate developments in the past 100 years in the economics profession. Even today, most economists are trained to judge markets as basically all failing, as all imperfect, as all inviting government intervention to fix them and bring them into better alignment with the theoretical conditions of general equilibrium in the perfectly competitive model. And this has done great mischief, because when politicians meet economists who believe this, they see an opportunity to use neoclassical analysis and neoclassical economists as an excuse or a pretext for what they want to do for altogether different reasons. I did in my career quite a lot of consulting work involving economic policy making in a variety of areas. And what I found was that we expert advisors were never decisive. In fact, it's doubtful to me we had any influence at all. But we were there, we were having our say, we were invited to testify or write reports, and then the politicians went ahead and did what served their own interests, which I believe they always do. So neoclassical economists have fooled themselves into believing that policymakers want to hear what they have to say. And I think that is almost never the case.
Bob, you are an expert economist and an expert economic historian. Now, I would like to move to the economics and the history of your homeland. I would like to ask you first something about the role of the state, the Leviathan, as is one of your books you titled it, in the first place, and then particularly I will ask you something about Roosevelt and the Great Depression. But let me start with a question about the state in the United States. Here in Europe, there is a long tradition of considering the United States un país liberal, a liberal country, a liberal in the European sense. I mean, a country where the state is a very small state. I have even read papers and articles that speak of the state of the United States as the minimal state of the 19th century libertarians. Tell us something about the truth of the size of the state in your country.
Well, if we go back more than 100 years, I think it is true that certainly compared to other parts of the world, the United States had a less intrusive government altogether. We have a federal system, so we have to think of both the local government, state government, and then the national government. But taking them all into account, government was not as important a presence in the United States in the late 19th century as it was in Europe or in Asia or other parts of the world. But that does not mean that government was not intruding, it was not important in some ways, was not taking significant actions, even in the 19th century. So the idea of a laissez-faire situation in the United States is a myth. That never existed, and there were always important departures from that ideal. But nonetheless, many members of the public, especially the educated public, did subscribe to very liberal ideas, and their embrace of liberalism in the European sense in the 19th century was ideologically important in restraining the state from doing more, because even then there were many people urging the state to take on new activities and new intrusions into the economy. But the ideology that was dominant in the United States until the very end of the 19th century helped to restrain those moves to make the government bigger. And so even as late as 1900, the government was still relatively small. For example, all government spending at every level was equivalent to only about 7% of GDP. So quite small, and it had never been much bigger except during major wars. And even then, it had by and large retrenched to the status quo antebellum after the wars ended. But in the late 19th century, the ideology was beginning to break down. It was under attack from socialists, from what we call progressives in the United States. There are soft socialists, people who favor very active government involvement in almost every area of economic and social life. And the progressive era of the early 20th century was fundamental in changing the nature of American society and the role of government, because what it did was transform the opinion leaders of the United States, especially, not so much the general public, but they came later, led by the opinion leaders. But the opinion leaders, by and large, were brought over to progressive thinking by the time of World War I. And then the experience of the United States in the World Wars and in the Great Depression gave great push, great impetus to cause government to grow much bigger. And in each case, there was what I call a ratchet effect of the government's emergency actions, because even though these actions were often represented to be temporary actions only to meet the existing emergency, they were not rescinded afterwards completely. There was always a legacy that remained from what the government did during national emergencies. And the quick succession of these emergencies, from World War I to the Great Depression to World War II, all of this happened in a very short time. And during that time, the United States was transformed. The old allegiance to laissez-faire was almost destroyed. And so by the time we get to the late 1940s, the United States is far, far away from what it had been, even as late as 1914. And then it continues to drift even more in the same direction for a variety of reasons after that.
Now I would like to ask you particularly about the Great Depression, the New Deal, and Franklin Roosevelt. There is also a much popular idea in Europe and possibly in the United States as well, that Roosevelt was the great hero because his measures of expanding the public expenditure during the 1930s through the New Deal were responsible for lifting the American economy out from the recession. So I know that you have studied this a lot, so please tell us something about that, and also something particularly about Roosevelt himself, because I always thought that he is one of the most unjustly considered heroes in the history of the 20th century. We have this sort of an image of a saint. I was last week in Guatemala, and they have the Avenida Roosevelt, and in every country in the world you have a Roosevelt Avenue or street. He's considered a hero. He was such a strange figure, this paternal figure, this fireside talks, like if he was our father taking care of ourselves. So please tell us something about that.
Even to this day, Roosevelt is very highly regarded in the United States. Politicians all revere him. Even politicians of the Republican Party speak very highly of Roosevelt. And in truth, they speak somewhat honestly, because what they admire about him was his true ability, which was the ability of a politician, the ability to make political things happen. This was unexpected, by the way. Nothing he had done before becoming president gave people any reason to suspect that he was anything out of the ordinary. He was just what we call garden variety politician, and an even less worthy individual. He was a dishonest man who lied almost every time he opened his mouth. He, like most politicians, used people mercilessly. He was vindictive, and when people opposed him, he did everything in his power to destroy those people, all covertly rather than usually in the open. So he was really a vile man, but as it happened in the Depression, so many people were desperate for relief. Roosevelt came along and provided the leadership for people to get what seemed to be relief from their plight. And I've known many old people who've told me stories about how if it hadn't been for some New Deal program, like the Civilian Conservation Corps that employed young men to go work in the forest, they believe they would have starved. So they actually believe they owe their lives to Roosevelt. Now that's dying out, because the people who had those experiences are mostly gone already. But nonetheless, in academia, Roosevelt's reputation has been held up, for the most part, very high, because in the United States, the historical profession is almost totally wedded to progressivism or even more radical leftist views. So there's no opposition of any importance to this myth that continues to be broadcast to students generation after generation. What was done under the New Deal was not all done because Roosevelt thought it was a good idea. Roosevelt had almost no ideas of any kind about economics or how to make economic policy, but he did provide a warm reception to advisors who had lots of ideas about what to do, and he did provide an opportunity for important interest groups to make decisions about public policy. In the beginning especially, even business interests were given an open door to come in and set policy measures to suit themselves. In many cases, these were policies that people had been trying to get for a very long time. But the New Deal broke the dam and allowed all of these ideas to come together at once, because it made people so desperate to try something to relieve the situation. But when we go back and analyze the effect of these New Deal policies, we find in almost 100% of the cases, I won't say 100%, but almost all of them were counterproductive. They actually had the effect of preventing recovery from the depression, the effect of prolonging the depression when if the government had done nothing, then the depression would have ended much sooner and there would have been much less suffering. So the irony of Roosevelt's reputation as a hero who saved people from the depression is that everything he did worsened the situation for them, but because he was doing something and making claims for what he was doing that were plausible, at least to untrained people, and I'm sorry to say, even to many trained economists who lost their nerve at the time. But nonetheless, many people viewed some of these New Deal programs as making positive contributions to relieving the depression. But I believe more and more economists have eventually concluded, even neoclassical economists, that the New Deal did not help. There's still a strong view that the abandonment of the gold standard was a decisive New Deal measure that pulled the United States out of the Depression and did the same thing in other countries. I await the day when people see that that's a mistake too, that they're misreading the effect of abandonment of the gold standard. They're misunderstanding what happened, but that's a longer story. But nonetheless, more and more economists have come to see the New Deal as counterproductive and as not worthy of the adulation that the American public has paid to it.
Luis Alberto, ¿tengo tiempo de una pregunta más? 3 minutos. Y nuestro voto de confianza al público lo dejamos para el año que viene, para el Premio Juan de Mariana del año que viene. Okay, but my last question, I would like to change completely the subject. You have been long associated with a private organization that is the Independent Institute. And if we try to find differences between Europe and America, perhaps the strength of the civil society is one of these points. And I mean not only North America. Guatemala is not North America. And you have we have there the Universidad Francisco Marroquín, which is a very good example of a private institution striving for liberty. How is that kind of institutions doing in the States, particularly your one, but also the rest? I think it's an admirable difference that the United States has, your Independent Institute, or the Liberty Fund, or the Cato Institute, and so on and so forth. Tell us something about that.
There's no doubt that since the 1960s, which was a kind of low point for true liberalism in the United States, since that time there has been a strong counter-movement against all the developments that had occurred between the 19th century and 1970, roughly. Starting in the 1970s and gaining strength afterwards, there was a strong rebellion against progressivism, against progressive policies, against the ideas that had become widely embraced, not just by policymakers, but by the general public. And these institutions that you mentioned, and there are hundreds of others, are part of the response that has taken place. I think sometimes because the people involved in fighting progressivism don't want to lose heart, they overestimate how important their efforts have been. And I wouldn't say their efforts have been unimportant or insignificant, but I think we need to recognize that even now, here in 2015, Progressivism is the dominant ideology of the United States, especially among establishment figures in politics, in the media, in the major universities and other institutions. So it is important, it's true that true liberals have fought back and had some effect in winning people over as against progressive ideas. But there's a long distance to go.
Okay, thank you very much, Bob. Thank you all. We're going to have now a half an hour rest. Okay, thank you all.